Welcome to a Wonder Junkie podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Anderson.
Nobody knows what's going on. Nobody knows. Nobody has the faintest idea. The best guesses are lies. You may be sure of it.
All right. Well, Dr. Stephen Grossberg, I really do appreciate your time this morning, and it's an honor to have you here.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Wonderful things about Zoom is you can be anywhere, and I can be anywhere, and it's clear as day.
I know. It really is a miracle, and I love thinking about the nature of just that in itself, that I can speak to these amazing people from all over the world. So it really is a cool feature of this time and space that we live. So yeah, I wanted to start off. We have a little bit of a list of questions that you told me to do for you because you like to follow the order, which is nice. You know, usually I just do free flow conversation, but I have a nice little list here, and it'll be fun to go through the list and discover a little bit about how you got so enamored in this field and when, and start to explore some of your ideas and share it with the general audience. And so in the beginning of the conversation, I thought it would be fun to just ask you some basic fundamentals, like what age did you start exploring consciousness and get so enamored in this field?
When you ask me question one, I will, of course, tell you all that.
Yeah. So what age did you start exploring consciousness, and how did you get so enamored in this field?
Oh, it is your first question. Oh, my goodness. I should look at my notes more often. Well, to answer your question properly, I need to give some background about my previous scientific work that led to the discoveries. And it'll also answer several of the other questions, because you simply don't wake up in the morning and say, today I'm going to study consciousness. That would not only be hubris, but it would fail. And so I started many years ago, before you were born, in 1957, when I was a 17-year-old college freshman at Dartmouth College, taking introductory psychology. And for reasons one can't explain, my brain sort of exploded. And in response to studying classical learning data in humans, I was led to introduce the paradigm of neural networks for modeling how brains make minds, as well as the basic equations that people still use today. And that's why, given that I started in 57 and laid this foundation, a lot of people call me the father of AI. Although I'm so old now, I could be the great-grandfather of AI. During that introductory psychology course, I became excited by classical data about how humans learn. That's critical to say. In particular, a proper analysis of learning leads to discoveries about why we're conscious of what we're learning. So in particular, at that time, there was wonderful data by American psychologists about how we learn lists of items. And the items in lists can be letters, like you're learning the alphabet, or words, like you're learning a poem, or sequences of navigational turns, like how you get from the bedroom to the bathroom, or from home to the grocery store, or sequences of arm movements, so how you dance or use a tool. And so I felt, although the data were sort of group data, I felt the need to understand how individuals, like me as a behaving individual, learns a list moment by moment in real time, like practicing the alphabet. Practice makes perfect. And because I thought in real time, which no one told me to do because I was 17, that was what was interesting to me. What's going on in my mind when I am learning the alphabet? I was led to discover my first neural networks. And I'll try to clarify how. whose nodes, there are nodes in the network, are the items like A, B, C, D, and there were directed connections between the nodes. For example, let's say you want to learn the list A, B, just starting the alphabet. There'd be a connection from the node that represents A to the node that represents B, and such a node in the brain is called a cell population or group of cells or cell size. And the connection is called an axon, AXON. And when A is presented from the external world in your brain, at the node A, it gets activated. You can call it a short-term memory trace or STM trace, because it'll only be active for a short time. And when it gets activated for a short time, it sends a signal down the axon, let's say from A to B. And at the end of the axon is an adaptive wave, also called a long-term memory trace or LTM trace. That's where the learning occurs. And so if a signal from A to B, it gets to the end of the axon where there's a little structure called the synaptic knob, and the space between the axon and the next cell is called a synapse. And if B gets activated when that signal from A comes, then information from A and B are both simultaneously felt in the synaptic knob. And you start learning AB by what we say is associative learning. You associate A with B. And then in the future, if you present A, the node or population A gets activated, sends a signal down, let's say the path to B. It has a big long-term memory trace due to learning, and so B will get activated. And so you learn A precedes B. And the same argument occurs for any letter, not only letters, what we call chunks, any internal representation of some kind of item. And there are axons between every pair of nodes. So there's a connection from A to B to learn AB. There's a connection from B to A to learn BA. And if you take all the connections between all the possible nodes, there's a lot of feedback because A can go to B and B can go to A. You've defined a recurrent neural network. And that's what I derived in 57 when I was 17. I used this recurrent neural network in order to explain psychological data about how humans learn lists of verbal units, whether in serial verbal learning or paired associate learning. And you might say, how could I be driven this way? I'm not going to go into that, but I was forced into it by problems, philosophical problems in the data that thrilled me, that seemed very paradoxical. And to a 17-year-old, a paradox, wow. And that project led to an explosion of results over the last 68 years that eventually led me to explain how, I like to say, brain evolution achieves behavioral success, how to link brain to behavior, because after all, that just means that Darwinian selection, evolution, is guided by how well our behaviors succeed. And if they don't succeed, you're wiped out, you fail. So in summary, because of the fact that brain evolution needs to achieve behavioral success, you have to start with psychology. You have to study scores or even hundreds of psychological experiments about the topic that you're interested in. And of course, even knowing what experiments fit together so they'll all help you to understand hidden design principles and mechanisms. This in itself is not given to you. Okay? So even knowing what experiments should cohere together to help you think theoretically isn't a given. And to understand it, you think about the data for such a long time that you start developing a kind of experimental intuition. You have a feeling of what should belong together. You can sort of see how it might fit together.
Mm.
But you don't have words. You don't have science yet. You just have feelings about images. And one of the challenges is that lots of the data are published using graphs like time t, and then some dependent variable that changes with t, like how performance accuracy changes with the number of learning trials. So it might go up. But first, that's group data. It's not real time. And I always felt I want to know how individual learners are achieving this adaptation moment by moment in real time. And so I had to learn how to think in real time. And that's really hard to do.
Yeah.
That's one of the main things I've taught my graduate students and postdocs and other faculty. By example, by sitting together like in a medieval apprenticeship, I talk about this, and then they gradually get more and more competent to talk back. So thinking about behaviors occurring in real time, it's always led me to discover underlying design principles and mechanisms whose interactions do generate the observable behaviors. And this is a speculative leap. You know, Einstein himself talked about a speculative leap. It's not an algorithm. It's a truly creative process that's hard to explain. It's only when you have good enough intuition, when you're living with the data, because, why is it a speculative leap? It's because the behaviors are emergent or interactive properties of many brain regions interacting together. And for that, you need theory. You need a model to rigorously model how those interacting brain mechanisms generate the emergent properties that map quantitatively onto real-time behavior of the individual.
Yeah.
So I was driven into deriving models. I can say brain mechanisms now because I gradually realized that my psychological analysis of behavior in real time led to brain mechanisms. I knew I had a network, but I didn't know it was part of a brain. And I only found that out because I was a freshman and I had pre-med friends, and they were telling me some of the things they were learning about neuroanatomy and neurophysiology, cell bodies, axons, synapses, transmitters. And I said, wow, I already derived that. And that led to a sense of ecstasy that's hard to explain. I like saying, I'm not sure I mean it. I like saying that's better than sex. You know, something for the first time about something you're dying to know.
Yeah.
Well, but you can understand a brain in one theoretical step. We're never done. So I was led to discover a modeling method and a cycle whereby at any stage in the cycle, I could explain a lot of behavioral data with a neural network mechanism and its emergent properties. But then I would explain a lot more data than I put in hypotheses. But eventually I could see what I couldn't explain. I like saying the boundary between the known and the unknown. And that helped guide me to try to figure out, well, what's missing? Then I would see there's another design principle, a mechanism, and so on. And this went on, getting more and more explanatory depth and power, more links between brain and behavior in a way that each enhancement was consistent with what I already had explained. Otherwise, it would have, at any point in theory development, you could hit a brick wall and then you have to start over. I never hit a brick wall. And that was 68 years I've been doing it relentlessly. I've continued doing this cycle myself and with very gifted collaborators to the present time to provide principled and unifying explanations of ever more interdisciplinary data about how brains make minds, including all the main processes whereby our brains make our conscious minds. We're getting there in both healthy individuals and clinical patients. And that's why in 1989 already, when I was giving the annual university lecture at Boston University, once a year, some scholar gives a university lecture to the whole Boston area. The president of BU, John Silver at that time, who was, a real tough bird, introduced me as the Newton and Einstein of the mind. And I almost fainted. He didn't warn me. So since 89, I'm also known as the Newton and the Einstein of the mind. And, one could try to ask why, but why he said that. And that was before I wrote anything explicitly about consciousness. So a key result of my modeling method and cycle is brain anatomy and neurophysiology are natural designs for learning and performing adaptive behaviors autonomously in real time. So our brains are the paradigmatic example of designs for autonomous intelligence. So one of my discoveries, and I'm going to say a little more about consciousness, how I got into studying consciousness as it was through the back door, was just as I never dreamed I'd understand anything about how brains work, I certainly never dreamed that I'd have anything sensible to say about consciousness. So if anyone says, oh, that's easy, remember that our brains are cognitively impenetrable. That means for centuries, people didn't know that our intelligence is in our brain at all. They thought it was in our pineal gland, or for many years in our heart. Okay. So anyway, one of my discoveries starting in 1975 and 6 is called adaptive resonance theory, or ART. It came out of my lifelong love of how humans and animals learn. I can say without embarrassment, it's the most advanced cognitive and neural theory that explains the most psychological and neurobiological data about how humans consciously see, hear, feel, and know things about the world. And we don't have conscious states just to platonically enjoy the world as we, sit in our scarlet seat. We use conscious states to plan and act to realize value goals. And one of the things I discovered is why it is that at a certain stage of processing, many prior stages of brain processing didn't become conscious. It's only when the representations get complete and predictive enough to lead to successful behavior. So we do survive Darwinian selection, that there's a resonance, an adaptive resonance, whereby we have one or another form of consciousness. Now, why should you believe adaptive resonance theory or art? Well, I think one good reason is that I discovered, no, I didn't discover, I discovered art in 76, but I was explaining a lot of data with art. And, sometimes, as in physics, Einstein, with special and general relativity theory, eventually could explain them with thought experiments, not initially necessarily. What is a thought experiment? It's a simple story that follows logically from hypotheses that we all know, facts about the world. So it's not something you have to be a scientist or, even educated. They're things we experience in our life. And why can they lead to profound scientific truths? Because when they act together, they act like constraints on the evolution of our brains in this particular case. So I derived art from an oft-cited article published in Psychological Review in 1980, where Psych Review was then, and I think still today, is the leading theory journal in psychology. So it wasn't, in some corner of the literature, it was in the heart of the literature, using just a few simple facts. But what the thought experiment was about, what the story told, was how any system can autonomously learn to correct predictive errors in a changing world filled with unexpected events. The hypotheses never mention mind or brain, so art is a universal solution of the problem of autonomous learning, recognition, and prediction in a changing world. And that's one reason you find homologues of art throughout phylogeny. In particular, art can pay attention. There's top-down expectations that help you focus your attention on the subset of features you're processing bottom up. This subset are the critical features, the critical feature patterns that enable you to successfully predict the world. And it's these critical features that you pay attention that drive learning in the bottom-up adaptive filters that choose recognition categories. And active recognition categories read out, learn top-down expectations that also learn the critical features. So we are designed to throw away irrelevant outliers by suppression and to focus attention and learn about the things that are predictively successful in our experience. So when there's a good enough match between the bottom-up adaptive filter and an active top-down expectation, that closes a positive feedback loop because the features excite the category excites the features. It's excitatory in both ways. The loop closes. And it goes into a resonant state, boom, 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 that can synchronize, prolong, and amplify the attended information of the critical features while suppressing irrelevant outliers. And that resonance state triggers fast learning of what you're paying attention to and dynamically buffers your learning against catastrophic forgetting. Mm-hmm. So art, that's why, you might smell a smell you haven't smelled since you were 5. Suddenly you're in the kitchen. You're back there. That's happened to me many times. That's because of the stability plasticity dilemma. Otherwise, we couldn't keep learning. throughout life because new learning could overwrite and cause catastrophic forgetting of old learning. And now keep in mind that if you're studying a lot of AI like deep learning, it does experience catastrophic forgetting. Okay? You can't use it throughout the incremental life. But at any point, you can run it, and suddenly you get 30 years of slow learning. There are other weaknesses of deep learning, if you get to that. So what was used to provide quantitative explanations and computer simulations about lots of psychological and neurobiological data about objects and events that we experience moment by moment. And then I began to gradually realize that these explanations were isomorphic with our conscious recognition of these experiences. And I realized that I had derived my first conscious resonance through the back door. And this first resonance is called a feature category resonance because the resonance links the attended distributed features with the categories that recognize them. And I realized that feature category resonance supports conscious recognition of what you're looking at. But that's not the same thing as conscious seeing or conscious hearing. Conscious perception and conscious recognition are not the same thing. Well, we can say why immediately because you open your eyes, you see stuff. You might never have seen it before. Let's say someone took you on a plane ride and you went for the first time to Alaska and you got out and you saw glaciers. You'll see them, but you won't recognize them. You say, what the hell is that? Recognition is about stuff we know. There's a difference between seeing, which is general purpose, and knowing, which we gather through our life experiences. The resonances that support conscious seeing, I call surface shroud resonances. I won't go wide. The ones that support conscious hearing are stream shroud resonances and so on. But that led me, I guess it was 2009 when I was able to first assert that. So the point is, which I love, that a conscious recognition emerged from a model of how we solve the stability plasticity dilemma, how we learn without forgetting just as quickly, how we learn without catastrophic forgetting. So an analysis of human learning inexorably led to discoveries of consciousness, about consciousness. And so further model explanations of psychological and neurobiological data, different data, led me to understand or assert how we consciously see, hear, feel, and know things about the world. And as I said before, I could see clearly in a scientifically rigorous way how we use our conscious states to plan and act in the world to realize value goals. And that's why I say it's a solution of the classical mind-body problem, because we're not just platonically contemplating the world with consciousness. We need consciousness to act on the world. And given the universality of these thought experiments, I believe that every creature on the planet that solves the stability plasticity dilemma has one or another form of conscious awareness.
I love that you've answered a lot of our questions with that nice long beginning. And
I did. Because why don't you ask me the next two questions?
Exactly. No, I love that. And it also makes me, I'll stick to this list, but it makes me curious about in 1957, what were the tools and technologies that were available to us to explore the mind at that time? They were very limited.
Most, if you wanted to know about learning, you just did, um, you might have a human in a room where uh, items would occur one or another, one after another through time. Let's say A occurs in the window, and then it goes away, and a little while later B occurs, and then C occurs. So you do human experiments. There was nothing like scalp electrodes, nothing like indwelling electrodes to help with epilepsy. It was all psychological. Um, there were, and this was basically, apart from Ivan Pavlov, an American sport, the great learning psychologists were all American. And in Europe, people like Helmholtz, Maxwell, and Mach studied visual perception uh, rather than learning. And Helmholtz, who was a great genius, who worked in psychology and physiology and physics. He was a great physicist. He wrote the classic books about sight and sound. He also did a very early physiological experiment, which was based on philosophy. Because a lot of people believe that as soon as you have the idea of movement, you move. So he measured how fast signals go down the arm to the finger and how fast the hand could clench. And it wasn't instantaneous. So that was one of the great classic physiologists. But maybe we should move on.
Yep. Yeah, because I'd love to get back to at some point the imagination and how you started to predict a lot of these things that you were using to write down, but we'll get to that later.
I'll just give you a one-word answer. It's a gift that I've treasured and tried to be worthy of. It's a gift.
It's amazing.
Yes, Einstein or Bohr, how they made their discovery, none of them could explain it.
Yeah, it sure is a fascinating mystery, I guess, the imagination.
Yes, yes, it is.
So I love what you've said about your theories and how you got to this way of thinking. And then I started to think about the next question, which is how would these resonance models scale down to explain something like a collective intelligence or a non-neural system like a cell or bacteria?
In 1978, I published a foundational article about human memory, which included art, among other models. That had a big explosion of creativity during those years. But in the same year, I published an article called Communication, Memory, and Development. In fact, at first I wanted to publish them both in a book, but I was so naive, I didn't know how to get a book published. I just did. But in my article on communication, memory, and development, I argued that all cellular organisms, not just brain, not just in mammals, they share properties across phylogeny. And I think of the shared properties of all cellular organisms as what I've called a universal developmental code. And in chapter 17 of my 2021 magnum opus, which I call Conscious Mind, Resonant Brain, How Each Brain Makes a Mind, which if anyone hasn't read and is interested, when I last looked, even though it's almost 800 double column pages with over 600 color figures, it was sold on Kindle for $9.95 or $9.99. And the reason it was so cheap is I subsidized it with my own funds. I don't do science to make money. I do science to communicate. So because I want you to read. And that provides a conscious mind resonant brain provides a self-contained and non-technical overview and for many of my discoveries since 57, as well as data of hundreds of other scientists. But if I read you a part of the introduction of my paper, Communication, Memory, and Development, remember I wrote it I published it in 78. So I'm not claiming it's the latest and the greatest, because God forbid no progress has been made since, but it gives a kind of concise answer to your question.
Mm-hmm.
So this paper suggests that a variety of developmental mechanisms can be viewed as variations on a small number of organizational principles. These principles represent solutions to environmental problems that all living creatures must surmount. The principles studied with several examples which all share common statistical and geometrical properties for the collective behavior of cells. The properties achieve efficient parallel processing of patterned information, because it's patterns, no matter what the organism is. Patterns contain a lot of the most important information, which thereupon triggers a new level of system organization. The laws unify, transform, and extend results by such authors as Turing, Gustafson and Walpert, Keller and Siegel, Gira and Meinhardt, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So here's the main point. The laws suggest that cellular systems have certain functional advantages, such as automatic gain control and its consequences, such as self-regulation and adaptation, that have been omitted from previous models. The examples considered are tuning of genicular-cortical connections in the kitten, sea urchin gastrulation, slime mold aggregation and slug motion, transplantation of the cuticle in Rodnius, generation of hydra's heads, self-streaming individuation, and emergence of a leadership group in a competitive intergroup interaction. And I say what some of the mechanisms are. And I say in particular the comparison between cortical tuning in our brains and gastrula formation in sea urchin suggests a self-corrective feedback mechanism whereby syncytium development can overcome a small genetic error. And I show how the transition from a blastula to a gastrula in any species uses a kind of adaptive resonance to dynamically stabilize morphogenesis in this case. So, and I've worked on a number of related things. You want to ask me another question that's related there, so I'm trying to space it.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I appreciate that. And it's leading me to the next question of, have you encountered Michael Levin's work and his embodied minds theories? And it does sound a lot like you and him are agreeing a lot of this emergent phenomena of consciousness.
Well, just a few days ago, Michael and I were both on the same podcast at different times, and I chatted with him. He's at Tufts, which is very near where I live, so we'll probably get together.
Great.
But I don't regularly study Michael's work because it's often about embryogenesis, but I have contributed to understanding some processes during embryogenesis. And chapter 17 in my magnum opus reviews. And so let me read part of that so you get a feeling. The header is a calcium spectrum in HeLa cancer cells, xenopus oocytes, and cardiac myocytes. So we're getting out of brains and getting out of mammals and even animals. So he talks about spectral timing, which I introduced many years ago. That's how you do adaptively timed things. For example, let's say you're in class and you're dying to raise your hand. But you know that unless you wait until your turn, the teacher's going to get very pissed off with you. Spectral timing helps you time the interval before you raise your hand. It's an ancient discovery. The spectral timing seems to be an ancient discovery that reappears in various forms in many living systems. Even in non-neural tissue, these timed spectra are due to quantal release of calcium gradients from inositol 1,4,5 triphosphate sensitive intracellular stores. Such a time spectrum has, for example, been reported in HeLa, that's HeLa cancer cells. A HeLa cell is a cell type in an immortal cell line that was derived from cervical cancer cells taken on February 8th, 1951 from Henrietta Lacks. And it's been crucially important in all biomedicine since then. So a spectrum in the form of an intracellular Ca calcium pool in HeLa cells is composed of functionally discrete units. And upon stimulation by histamine, these units give rise to localized calcium signals, and their sequential activation and summation really give rise to a spectral response. That's what I don't want to go into all the details. And you find the same kind of spectral dynamics for adaptive timing in the cerebellum, the hippocampus, and the basal ganglia of our own brains. So this is preserved through phylogeny in one form or another. And variations of these dynamics can be found in many kinds of cells, including the puffs in xenopus oocytes and the sparks in cardiac myocytes. And the evolution of spectral timing from an ancient and widespread process governing calcium signaling to a process that can be modulated by associative learning to carry out adaptively timed brain functions is a fascinating topic, and a lot more should be done to study it. But we have used it to explain a lot of data about adaptively timed learning in a whole series of articles. Leading, in fact, to a Journal of Neuroscience article where we go into the underlying biochemistry in great detail and how it generates its properties. So about xenobots, L11, I don't study them per se, but my models have been used to design autonomous, adaptive, mobile robots for various tasks, including MIT Lincoln Lab used a lot of my models to design mobile robots, and it's been used to design, robotic hands and stuff like that. And an advantage of some of my models is they're platform independent, so they can be used for controllers of many kinds. So you could use the same algorithm with very small modifications on something that has wheels or legs. You know, the platform doesn't matter. It got this universality property. Anyway, you were going to ask me another question, but I hope that gives a flavor of. I'm very interested in embryogenesis as an illustration of the fact that various of my models have universal properties that hold in multiple species, and you can view the underlying dynamics as having evolved and been promiscuously used by evolution for multiple tasks.
Okay. And that spectral timing that you're bringing up, it seems like that's going to be really fundamental for when people are developing AI and deep learning, things like this.
Well, deep learning can't be used for that because I forget if I talk about deep learning with you. Did you ask me about deep learning?
No.
Okay, well, why don't we put that off to the end?
Yeah.
Why I don't think spectral time can be used for deep learning.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Michael Levin sure is a fascinating guy. I like listening to him speak, but I don't understand, obviously, a lot of what he says because I'm not scientifically trained, but he sure is brilliant. Um, let's go and describe CLEARs, conscious learning, expectation, attention, resonance, and synchrony, and how you came up with this description about the nature of consciousness.
Let me just say the following. Well, what competitive learning is, you have the bottom-up adaptive filter followed by competition, and the competition will choose the cell population or small cluster cell populations that gets the most activity and shut down all the other cells. And then you tune the filter of that bottom-up adaptive filter to more vigorously activate um, the uh, the category in the future, and that's how you maybe could get a grandmother cell or something like that. But so I had to introduce various machinery to that in stars. That's the adaptive, the recurrent competitive dynamics, the whole issue of competition, which is a huge topic, how recurrent competitive fields can do incredible amounts of decision making and information processing just by varying that one design. Let me make a comment here because I think it's apropos. You know, after going through 68 years of work, or with all the things we've discovered, what is the way you'd like to summarize how our brains work? Well, there's just a few basic equations, like short-term memory, medium-term memory, long-term memory, spectral time, and a few equations. Then there's a somewhat larger number of microcircuits or modules, like these recurrent competitive circuits. And then you take specializations of a small number of equations and a certain number of microcircuits, and you put them together into what I call a modal architecture, MODAL for modality, not model. So a modal architecture, let's say for vision, or for audition and speech, or for cognition. That's all there is. And it's very much like theoretical physics, because in theoretical physics, you might have Newton's laws or a generalization in Einstein's laws, a small number of laws, or Maxwell's laws for thermodynamics, which are subsumed by Einstein's laws. Then you'll have modules. They're like atoms and molecules. And then you'll have your modal architectures. They're like macroscopic objects, just like this. Okay, well, so within stars and recurrent competitive neural nets, I proved the theorem in 78 that in response to a sparse series of input patterns, not too many input patterns, competitive learning can learn stable recognition categories. You can put in a sequence of inputs and categories can keep getting learned and they won't get overwritten. And they even have Bayesian properties. However, I also showed that if you have dense, non-stationary inputs, like the blooming, buzzing confusion of our real lives, the whole thing experiences catastrophic setting. In the year before that, in 1975, I published an article about reinforcement learning or cognitive emotional interaction, where I needed my first resonance. And I figured, hey, let me take the top-down expectation from reinforcement learning, used it in cognition. That led to adaptive resonance theory as a perceptual and cognitive theory that doesn't have catastrophic settings. And then you can learn arbitrarily dense, non-stationary input sequences without catastrophic getting in. In fact, Gail Carpenter and I gave an example in 1978 with the simplest art algorithm. We have biological theory, which is computational, but it's mainly used to explain and predict psychological, neurobiological data. And then we develop algorithms for technology, used with very large scale technology and AI. And we showed fast learning, meaning on every trial, the adaptive weights go to their new equilibrium. It could learn a whole database in one learning trial, one fast learning trial. When we get to deep learning, we'll discuss how different that is from deep learning.
Yeah.
Okay. Now you want clears?
Yeah.
Okay. So why don't you ask me the question?
Yeah. Let me go back up to that. Yeah. Describe clears, conscious learning, expectation, attention, resonance, and synchrony, and how you came up with that.
Okay, well, these so-called clears processes, consciousness, learning, expectation, attention, resonance, and synchrony, they occur and interact in art, and they solve the stability plasticity dilemma. You need all of them. Well, I got to be clear. You need learning, expectation, attention, resonance, and synchrony. Those are properties of art. And then consciousness comes out of the wash. The Lear's processes imply clears, which means consciousness.
Excellent. And how could you say that art would be used to predict mental disorders, mental illness?
Okay, well, as I already said about consciousness, you don't wake up one day and say, oh, today I'm going to understand how Alzheimer's works.
Right.
That would be you, Bruce. But let me just give a little background that art isn't the only model that has helped me to begin explaining some behavioral symptoms of mental disorders. What I call my cognitive, emotional, motor, or COG-M model, that's my model of reinforcement learning and cognitive emotional interactions, is important too. There's a lot of mental disorders, not only in problems of cognition, they also involve problems of emotion. And so, after developing and using both art and COG-M to explain and simulate lots of data about normal, or maybe I'd prefer to say typical behaviors, because what's normal in our society may not be normal in other societies, and conversely. I began to notice that particular imbalances in processes that I had in the models led to syndromes of behavioral symptoms that looked a lot like certain mental disorders. So I really didn't do anything new. The model was mature enough. After all, you'd like to believe that if you understand typical behavior, the brain, how the brain gives a typical behavior well enough, by varying those brain processes, you'll understand how it breaks down and gives you abnormal symptoms. And that's what happens. So, and because of that, I can't go through every, imbalance and how it did it, but I've had the goal to write about how, what changes in brain mechanisms cause behavioral symptoms of Alzheimer's disease, autism, Fragile X syndrome, schizophrenia, medial temporal amnesia, post-traumatic stress disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, auditory and visual agnosia and neglect, and slow wave sleep. And let me be clear, like if you look at autism and the autism spectrum, it's known it's a multi-gene problem. Multiple things can go wrong and will go wrong in full-blown autism. But you can have high-functioning Asperger's people who may be creative geniuses. So it's complicated. But after, like in schizophrenia, it was one of the first things I studied. And I forget when, but more than 20 years ago, the main laboratory in Maryland studying schizophrenia clinically made sure I gave the opening keynote address at the Schizophrenia International Research Society on how my neural model became imbalanced to create behavioral symptoms of schizophrenia. So I'm not just in a little corner sort of masturbating my ideas. I mean, people invite me to give keynote addresses to explain how it works. But I do want to summarize my reply by saying, I think it's really important to show the transition from normal or typical behaviors to abnormal or atypical, thereby highlighting we all live on a spectrum of possible behaviors. And my PhD thesis advisor was a brilliant, wonderful man who, during the time I was trying to get my PhD thesis accepted, was carted off to Payne Whitney Mental Hospital because he had a manic depressive psychotic break. So, we're all on a spectrum. And some of the things that make us weird also make us remarkable.
Yeah, that's very true. And it's very fragile consciousness. So it's always interesting what makes things go wrong so quickly sometimes.
It can. There are singularities in phase transitions. Phase transition can be very abrupt.
Yeah. Well, the next question was about your book, Conscious Mind, Resonant Brain, and asking, why did you write it? What drove you to write it? And how long did it take for you to write that book?
Well, I retired in 2019, just before I became 80. I didn't want to, but the then provost and dean of our college wanted my salary. And I was pissed at them because my contract said I could have my endowed share, so I chose to retire. But the law of unexpected consequences struck. And for the first time in over 40 years, I didn't have to write grants, defend grants, train graduate students and postdocs, do collaborative research, write papers. I loved it. I loved every minute of it. But been there, done that. And I now had all the time in the world. And moreover, it was COVID. You
Hmm.
could travel. So for the first time in 40 years, I didn't have responsibilities to chair a department, direct research institutes, think of ideas to write grants, win grants, train the PhD students and postdocs to do the research, blah, 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 blah. So I had a lot of free time to finish a book that I had been writing already in 1999. But then life took over and I had this immensely creative period with lots of collaborators. And in the interim, I finally wrote down stuff about consciousness in greater detail. I mean, I had always said from the start in 1980 that in my Psych Review article that all conscious states are resonant states. But then I had to classify the different kinds of consciousness. I've done 6 of the main ones. It's not over yet.
Hmm.
So I finished writing the book in about a year. And that's true for several reasons. One reason is it's a self-contained and non-technical overview and synthesis of stuff that are already published in archival articles. And a lot of my archival articles are written to be non-technical. And then there are the technical ones, which are heavy duty sometimes. But another reason is that just before I retired, see, I had an endowed chair. I didn't have to teach regular courses. What I did was I trained over 100 PhD students, postdocs, and faculty. And I founded a department. I helped create all the courses, and then they did the day-to-day, and I trained the students when they were ready to do creative research. But I like giving periodic lecture series, and I gave one as a seminar to any students who wanted to come, no credit, just if you have some time. And I created 800 PowerPoint slides in color. I've always liked doing visual art. And my book used about 600 of them. So my lectures gave an overview that became the book, really, and including I had the figures. So that's why it went so fast. Often before writing a book, people have found first give a course on it or a lecture series, and then you've got all you need to polish it.
Hmm. And what were your writing habits? Like, were you writing in the evenings, in the mornings?
Well, I started to play the piano when I was in the 8th grade. And because of that, when my arpeggio playing fingers, I could learn to type 100 words a minute.
Wow.
In fact, I got temporary typing jobs in the summer to help make money for the family. You know, you don't even know temp typing. There were no word processors. In New York, there would be an office filled with temp typists
Hmm.
who would be asked to go to an office that needed a temp typist. And so I tried to apply to one, and they said, sorry, we have all the typists we need. And I said, well, you know, I was very shy, but I also had a little confidence. Let me take the test. I type really fast. And so I sit down and my fingers create this whirring sound on the typewriter. And the boss was in the next room with a door open, and he came in to see me, and he said, wow, I thought I was the fastest typist in New York. So I was working the next day. But
That's
the
cool.
bottom line is I can type as fast as I think.
That's amazing.
Huge blessing. A lot of people can't do that.
Yeah.
But before I write, you know, I don't just sit down and shoot off the top of my head. I'll always write down notes about what I want to write about, including keywords, phrases, concepts, complete references to the work of authors who I definitely want to cite as not only influences of the work, but also work I'll explain. And I try to develop intuition into the data I'm trying to explain. I said that at the very beginning. Without understanding the data, there's no there that there is. And I also mentioned I often can think visually about something before I have words to explain it. And I have feelings about, am I going in the right direction? Guide these images. So I'll get a series of images. And then finally, it becomes clear enough that I can write paragraphs in all books. So who can explain these things? I've written a lot about visual perception and imagery, and I've written a lot about feelings and how they work. But we're talking about it on a level that I can explain animal and even human data in, experimental situations. But we're talking about a level of creativity that I haven't tried to explain.
Yeah.
Although, I should say, I have a new book coming out in a few months, again, Oxford Press, and it's called Your Creative Brain and AI, I always have a colon, how we learn and consciously experience art, music, and meaning. So I'm very interested in creativity, but even that isn't on the level of, creating new stuff. In fact, in the book, I spend a preface and a chapter trying to justify why I have the hubris to write such a book, because I'm not a professional visual artist and I'm not a professional musician, which you would have to be in order to, have a deeper understanding. Anyway, yeah, so I think we're ready maybe for this.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you explaining that process because I think your next book will be fascinating to read. And even though you say you're not a professional artist, the things that you're writing and the work that you've done throughout your life is a balance of the science and the art. So it'll be nice to read that.
Well, I did all of the PowerPoint in my 2021 book, and
Yeah,
it's been pretty nice.
it's amazing. It's incredible. And then just the idea again of imagination and creativity being such a fascinating subject.
Interesting because it would have been impossible for me to try to explain in words to an illustrator what I needed to be drawn in all those illustrations.
Yeah,
Thank God I have that skill. It all sort of fit together.
yeah,
I
it's incredible.
to have it, and I treasure it. I try to respect it.
Absolutely. No, that's amazing. So the next question was about quantum models of consciousness and what you think about them.
Well, let me, people like Stuart Hameroff and Roger Penrose, who got the Nobel Prize in Physics, he's a brilliant man, have written about what they think is going on. Quote, quantum computation in microtubules. That's, a microscopic structure in axons, which I wrote about actually when in the 60s, microtubules in communication, memory, and development. Quantum computations in microtubules within neurons can potentially resolve the enigmatic features of visual consciousness, the representations of what we see in a microtubule. Well, unfortunately, they explain no data about how our brains give rise to conscious visual experiences. Moreover, they don't seem to be interested in explaining data. I've spoken to them. Or any data about the vast database in psychology or neuroscience about how we see. They're basically functioning like philosophers and scientists, but even good philosophers of mind usually try to explain some data about how the mind is doing what they're claiming to explain. And so, in brief, I believe in the scientific method, that you study the theories that provide principled explanations of the most data. There are going to be a lot of partial explanations, but you got to look at the theories that explain the most. And my theories explain orders of magnitude more data than any theory I know. And if you know one that you think contradicts me, I want to hear about it. I want to study it. But sadly, they explain no data. They have no theory of consciousness. And to think that microtubules can represent your seeing my face? What do they think the representation is? I have no. Penrose is not the only Nobel laureate who got the prize for something else, who's commented about consciousness. For some reason, they think if they got a Nobel Prize in one field, they can talk about consciousness, even though they don't know any data about consciousness. And I, who maybe solve the mind-body problem, will never get a Nobel Prize because it's so interdisciplinary. I don't belong to any clique. You've got to have a daddy to have a Nobel Prize. I don't have I'm the daddy.
That's amazing. I love that.
I had a daddy. Max Planck was one of his daddies.
That is hilarious. Well, what do you,
Yeah.
yeah, and what do you think about qualia? There's a lot of talk about qualia, and I've even had some neuroscientists on that speak about it.
Okay, well, the term qualia, let's just get our term straight, is often used to describe how and why brain activity generates subjective conscious experience, such as the redness of red or the painfulness of pain. Qualia describes the phenomenal aspect of consciousness, or what it is like, character of subjective experience. And with David Chalmers, I don't know if you've had him on, but David talks about the heart of consciousness. So conscious seeing, I claim, and supported by explaining a lot of data about visual perception, is defined by a surface route resonance that enables us to consciously see object surfaces and to use the surface representations to plan and act on objects that we want to engage with. Whether we can consciously recognize properties of images that we cannot consciously see. And let me draw one right now. I'll try to draw one. It's one of the first things in my 2021 book. Well, if this doesn't work for you, I'll go grab a copy of my 2021 book. Let me see if this works. That's the offset grading. It's a lot of horizontal lines. Can you recognize there's something vertical between the lines in the middle?
No.
You're not aware of some vertical thing that you cannot see?
No.
You can't. Interesting. Not everyone can. Let me get the book. Maybe in the book you can do it. But that's an example of consciously recognizing something you cannot see.
Oh, I see, like an illusion, which is everything.
Everything we consciously, I'm not even sure I can hold this up to you. It's figure 1-1, chapter 1, number 1 in my book.
Yes, I can see it. Yep, the little image on the left.
Do you see the offset grading?
Yes.
In that case, do you recognize some vertical thing between the horizontal lines?
Yes, now I can see it.
Okay, well, you don't see it. You recognize it.
Recognize it, yes.
Here's a, in other words, it's perceptually salient, but it doesn't carry qualia because it's not darker or lighter or nearer or further than the paper. It's very salient, but it has no qualia. Okay. So you don't need qualia to recognize things. And that's the whole point. Like, that's why the next figure is the famous figure of the Dalmatian in snow. If you look at it for a while, do you have a copy of my book?
Yes, I do.
Well, if you look at it for a while, first you might look at it and you just see splotches of black and white. But after, a few seconds, you recognize there's a dog there by completing a lot of its bounding contours. You don't see those boundaries. They're perceptually invisible. But you recognize the dog using them. And so I spend a great deal of time trying to explain the difference between seeing and knowing. It's not the case that you can just take a totally blank page and recognize something, except maybe you'd like to say, oh, I see the white surface. But that isn't the totally blank page because it has a border. And if the border is removed, you're in the Gansfeld and it goes dark. Genius white. So you need some kind of contour or etc. Okay, so let me do the honest about that. Well, yeah, not necessarily for all forms of consciousness, notably conscious recognition.
Okay.
The vertical boundary and the offset grading, you consciously recognize it with a feature category resonance, but it doesn't support its own surface shroud resonance.
And what about this is for the same subject matter, qualia. What about the experience of something like a emotion or a feeling during the sunset or seeing a color? Well, how does that correlate with your theories?
A feeling of color?
Yeah, like, if you feel, when it comes to feelings in relationship to vision.
I love this book. I don't think I talk about it. Yes. Well, keep asking me questions. We'll get to it. The other models of understanding consciousness. Okay, so you wanted to ask me at what point does brain become mind?
Yep.
Let me answer. Brain becomes mind when it resonates on internal or external information.
And even the resonates, when it resonates, that's a bit ethereal, or there's an element to it that's still a bit mysterious.
Well, resonances have been measured physiologically.
Right.
Multiple microelectrodes. But the fact is, anatomically, we have bottom-up pathways from the exterior of the world into the brain, deep. Bottom-up pathways at all these stages. But there are more top-down pathways than bottom-up pathways. Wherever there's a bottom-up pathway, there'll be at least as many top-down. And for years, people said, well, what the hell are they all for? And the reason is our brains are resonant pattern processes, self-organizing, autonomous, adaptively resonant pattern processes. And so resonance is at the heart of it. And any theory of mind that doesn't have a concept like resonance and how it controls learning is not even in the right ballpark. And the evidence is now overwhelming. You don't write a book this thick as just one of many publications with data supporting that claim. You can't ignore it. It's okay. Why don't we move on?
Yeah. So, what is the solution to the hard problem of consciousness?
We need to know our limitations. All scientific theories are defined by mathematical equations and the mechanisms and models that those equations describe. And our models can become so good that we can explain and predict everything that interests us. However, no equation can be red or happy. So our personal experiences of such qualia seem to lie outside the possibility of scientific explanations that use mathematics. And I don't know any other way to do theoretical science, whether it's physics or neuroscience or biology. It's all equations. I mean, we as humans use imagery to help us to understand what the equations represent. And it's a deep question whether if we didn't have the perceptual and cognitive apparatus to experience imagery and other such auxiliary sources of stimulation, if we would ever understand what the equations represent. But this is fine with me for the same reason it's fine with me. If scientists can predict the movements of the planets or even whole galaxies with our physical theories and their equations, you don't have to go out to visit the galaxy to understand and love what you're learning. And that's the way I feel about mind and brain. Once you understand enough of all the data you've ever wanted to know, and there's always going to be more, but there comes a point when you feel, oh, I understand a lot. All the things I thought I wanted to know about my mind when I was a kid, I've understood everything. And I've understood things I never dreamed I wanted to know about. So I feel I work like a dog to this day, but I feel this is enough. I don't have to be able to have an equation that is red and happy. And why we can't explain that with an equation really speaks to what is the difference between living cells and organs and machine imitation of them. Because you could build an autonomous adaptive mobile robot using the equations and models that I've developed with many people over the last 68 years. You could build it. And it could do a lot of things, a lot more than some other approaches. If you ask that robot, can you see red? Can you feel pain? Are you happy? I don't think the answer would be yes, unless you teach it that what I mean by red is an object that has the following reflectances. What I mean by pain is what happens in a human when you belt it really hard. So it can say, oh, yeah, I know what you mean, but I don't feel it.
Mm.
And yeah, I think I'm content at this point to live with that gap. Um,
Yeah, that goes into the next question, which was what are some of the limitations of our models of understanding consciousness right now? And there's quite a few, I'm sure, but
so I did in my magnum opus give a comparative analysis of some other um, consciousness theorists. And so I'm just going to, because, it'll be more efficient.
sure.
So the influential philosopher of mine, Daniel Dennett, wrote a book in 1991 called Consciousness Explained. That's hubris, I think, but anyway, it's certainly provocative, and that sells books. And Dan is a very good writer, and he's very smart, and he sells a lot of books. Although I think he died already.
Yeah, he recently died.
What to say? He's younger than me, and so many people younger than me are gone already. So in this book, Dennett argued for a multiple drafts model where discriminations are distributed in space and time across the brain. A concept that, without further elaboration, is too vague to have explanatory power. I just view it as a red herring. He doesn't know that, but he made a big to-do about it. And so he illustrated his theory, though, by discussing surface filling in. He claimed, well, the fundamental flaw in the idea of filling in is that it suggests that the brain is providing something when in fact the brain is ignoring something. Well, the brain doesn't have to fill in for the blind spot. You know what the blind spot is?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, when you're collecting all the axons from photoreceptors on the retina, they get all collected together to form the optic nerve. And that area of the retina can't see. That's the blind spot. The brain doesn't have to fill in for the blind spot. We don't notice these gaps, but they don't have to be filled in because we're designed not to notice them. That to me reads like reductio ad absurdum. But in other words, Dennett argues that a physical process of filling does not occur. Given that Dennett put an example of neon color spreading on the back cover of his book, which I consider important because, for example, the cover of my book, if you look at these red and blue squares, depending on how your vision goes, you're going to get either the red or the blue spreading out of those lines into the intervening space. But, doing it, through a Zoom is probably not possible. Given that, then I put an example of neon color spreading on the back cover of his book, he clearly viewed his claim as important, also about consciousness. But Dennis learned about filling in by attending a lecture in which I described my vision model, which explained and quantitatively simulated filling in and many other data about how we see brightnesses and colors in that one model. Dozens of experiments had a unified explanation. And subsequent experiments supported our explanations, including filling in does occur. It occurs as a physical process, multiple labs. And I invited Dan, because I believe in letting everyone have their say, to a conference I organized, which had good psychologists, neuroscientists, some modelers, and a couple of philosophers at the end, including Dan. And I made a point of giving a talk on vision where I explained filling in uh, among other things, right in your face, Dan. And he had to apologize in public. I didn't make him apologize, but he certainly couldn't give his usual shtick. He said something like, yeah, well, we philosophers have to learn the data. But I'd already given a lecture with the data and the explanation of the data. But I'm sure when I'm not around, he kept making the same old argument to sell his book. So various other authors have made interesting comments about consciousness based upon properties of perceptual neurobiological data. Notably among them is the excellent Dutch experimental neuroscientist Victor Lame, Lame. However, his contributions haven't proposed organizational principles or brain mechanisms to try to understand the brain dynamics of individual conscious experiences, including how they may share similar principles of resonant dynamics, yet also occurring in different brain regions. So it's not a real explanation in the sense of explaining how brain dynamics provides the conscious perceptual experience of different gap. The big is and here's where I wanted to go to this. Perhaps the theory of Antonio Damasio comes closest to theoretically linking brain to mind in his beautifully written 1999 book with the title, The Feeling of What Happens, Body and Emotion in the Making of Consciousness. And so Damasio used clinical data to guide him to what is in effect a heuristic definition of the cognitive emotional motor model or COGM model, which I'd already published in 1971. So his data confirmed predictions of my mind. But unlike COGM and its refinements, Damasio's theory provides no mechanistic account and could therefore provide no data simulations or predictions based on his model's emergent properties, nor could he situate his heuristic concepts within a larger theory of how brain resonances and consciousness work. I love his work, but he doesn't do the whole thing. So these various alternative efforts to explaining consciousness show that without a principled theory that can mechanistically link brain mechanisms to mental functions, even the most ingenious heuristic insights ultimately hit a brick wall and can't be further developed into a theory of how our brains consciously experience the world. So for me to do it, I very luckily started young. I very luckily started trying to explain psychological data about learning, then branched off into all these other aspects of mind, and very rapidly was able to make the link between brain and mind. It's just my great that this was my life. But if you can't make that link, you don't know enough psychology, if you don't know enough neuroscience, if you don't know enough theory to make rigorous how brain interactions generate the emergent properties that map on to the behavioral experience, you hit a brick wall.
Mm.
And my good luck with my life let me do that. Always very grateful.
That's amazing how much work you've done in this field. And I was going to ask you what some of the biggest breakthroughs that you hope you would see in neuroscience and in philosophy and in understanding consciousness in the future.
Yeah. Well, a lot of recent excitement in experimental neuroscience is due to new methods. It is, it's the foundation of the subject is experimental, and so methods let people use the method to sweep out all the possibilities that that method can let you understand. It opens a new window into experiments. So, some of the most exciting things are cellular and molecular neuroscience, including optogenetics and proteinomics. But I'm personally more interested in methods that can completely measure patterns of neurophysiological activity that correlate strongly with observable behavior they control. To link brain to mind, because brain evolution needs to achieve behavioral success. And one such method is the use of large arrays of microelectrodes placed in multiple parts of the brain, say in awake behaving monkeys that are doing interesting perceptual learning or cognitive tasks. That required years of brilliant technological development, as well as the computer methods for analyzing huge amounts of data. I remember when I was a student at Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, that Pepper Hartline, who studied the limulus retinue, getting the right machines to do the measurements and the right electrodes and the right ways of analyzing the data with a lot of effort. The experiment was just a small part of what he had to do. You needed the whole methodology and technology. So I hope that more will be done to link physiology to behavior, in which you can actually get enough representation of the patterns of physiological activation to start being able to see how the emergent property is forming. A lot of people who do great work at it. Earl Miller at MIT is a real leader in this. And, there are electrodes used in human patients to diagnose and treat mental disorders like epilepsy and deep brain stimulation to help ameliorate Parkinson's disease, and brain-computer interfaces for controlling prosthetics in paralyzed patients. I hope these technologies get a lot of funding because they're so important. Stuff like that.
Amazing. Yeah, and in the next 10 years, what do you see happening with artificial intelligence and with the innovation of newer technology?
Well, I start with a caveat. I like to say I couldn't have predicted the present, so I don't think I can predict the future. That being said, I hope that a lot more work is done discovering, developing models that autonomous intelligence. I believe the theme of autonomy will become increasingly important in future technologies, or perhaps semi-autonomy, where a human operator can be offloaded for the autonomous control of routine tasks, but is in the loop and receives suitable alerts to deal with unexpected challenges. And a model like ART, or adaptive resonance theory, includes in its core design not only attentional system for doing the learning and expectation, but an orienting system that is activated by sufficiently novel or unexpected events. So an ART system in particular could be used to control routine tasks that learn, and will automatically alert a human operator if something is unexpected that it can't deal with. So that's some of, I think, like, autonomous driving or semi-autonomous. But, these are all complicated. Like, if you want autonomous cars on the road, look at what's happened with Tesla, horrible crash. I would feel safer if and when we ever get to a point, which we may never due to people not wanting it, let alone the technology, when all vehicles are autonomous and they're all talking to each other, so they physically can't collide.
Mm-hmm.
Have algorithms that collision avoidance. But with one in a road filled with humans with all their unexpected qualities and with non-standard intersections, dangerous. But that doesn't mean people shouldn't keep doing progress. But the progress gets sufficiently advanced, and maybe people think, "Oh, wow, yeah, we don't have to drive anymore."
Very
Yeah,
interesting.
I think it's in the next 5 or 10 years.
Yeah,
But you can't predict the future.
right. No, I appreciate that. How do your models integrate vision, attention, and object recognition in the real world?
Well, the cerebral cortex of our brains consists of lamina or layered circuits with 6 main layers in all perceptual and cognitive neocortex. And variations of a single canonical lamina cortical circuit carry out in our brains auditory and visual perception, attention, learning, and cognition. And my students and I have modeled such a canonical lamina cortical circuit and showed explicitly how the same circuit can be specialized in different cortical regions in a hierarchy of processing stages to carry out all the functions. We have models of lamina cortex that simulate more psychological and neurobiological data than any other model, lamina or non-lamina. And moreover, the transition to the lamina models, we didn't just wake up one day and say, I'm going to model lamina neocortex. We've been modeling perception for 20 years. When we suddenly realized how if we folded the processing stages that were in our non-lamina models in a much more efficient way, guided by no neuroanatomy, we not only could then re-simulate it all, but we could explain even more with the lamina cortical model, because among other things, in addition to specific data, one of the problems we had that drove us toward lamina neocortex was what I call analog coherence. In other words, you want to have representation that can still have a gray scale. This is more important than that, but to be more important than that, you don't have to be maximally activated. This has to show up. So we want to have analog representation, not just binary, all the way up the cortical hierarchy. We were having trouble with the non-lamina models, and it drove us into the lamina ones, which give you robust analog coherence. So I call the totality of these models the paradigm of lamina computing. And I think it'll revolutionize technology because variations of a canonical cortical chip, if it goes in a VLSI, and you put a whole family of them together, they can all be self-consistently connected, but they all have the same design, input-output design. You can get increasingly autonomous agents and algorithms.
Wow.
But the money that's needed to fabricate these chips is immense.
Yeah.
At least in your projects to get off the ground. And that, unfortunately, goes way beyond government grants. That would require an industry like a Google that's rich enough to feel that if we solve this, the future $1 trillion reward is worth the investment of tens or hundreds of millions. It's a big problem. And in fact, I don't know if you know who Carver Mead is.
No.
Well, Carver basically invented modern VLSI chips. And, he had this dream too. I used to talk to him and Federico Fishkin. And, getting this kind of thing funded is a bitch. And, so they have a company, Synaptics. They have to put out a product yesterday.
Mm.
They need big bucks. And it's hard to get big bucks. I almost got big bucks at one point, but due to really sort of gross internal politics in my university, our provost shut it down,
Mm.
brought in a fortune. And he didn't last for provost for long, but that was his thing. They wanted to cut down all the tall trees so they'd have more power.
Mm. Yeah, if you could prove it was a national defense thing and get the military involved, you could get that budget.
This was DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency.
Yeah.
DARPA director. I gave a lecture and he said, Steve, how much money would you need to do this? And he was willing to back it. And DARPA, by going directly to Congress, can get lots of money. But anyway, that's one of the few ways you can do it. But another thing, when I think about technology, many years ago, I was giving a keynote lecture at a conference. And after the lecture, often, people come up with questions, and I loved it when students seemed excited and they asked me questions. And the last person there quietly came up and he said, I'm from NSA, and that's National Security Agency. And he said, art is protecting the nation, and walked away. He'll illustrate why it might be protecting the nation. And NSA doesn't tell, but just like NSA, all intellectual property, all IP that companies use to get rich, they keep quiet. They don't want to let their competitors know. So when you see people talking about, bragging about the use of deep learning for this and that, those aren't those companies. And you might say, but deep learning does a lot of good things. And yes, that's true. Every decent model, no matter how weak it can be in some ways, no matter how many brick walls it can hit, can solve what I call the model-independent problems. And there are a lot of them. But when you get to any problem that requires real-time, autonomous incremental learning in an environment that can be changing unexpectedly, come to me. I've got the only models that I'm aware of. But, for routine stuff, sure. Use a convolutional network, use a nearest neighbor network, have a ball. Use a neocognitron of Fukushima, have a ball. Use it. Anyway, let's see. So, another question about books and stuff.
Yeah, I was going to ask you what books and individuals have inspired you most over the years.
Well, I usually read articles about experimental psychology and neuroscience to inspire my thinking. I love getting my hands dirty in gorgeous data. That's my thing, data. I also think about what I believe to be important functions of the mind. And so I seek out data to solve problems that I think of as important to understand myself and the people I know. And then I use the modeling method in Psycho to help develop the model. But as to books that got me started, let me see. A book I loved was called Sight and Mind An Introduction to Visual Perception, written by Lloyd Kaufman, who was a professor of psychology at NYU, who I really liked very much. Lovely, lovely man. And then there's also the wonderful book by Hans Wallach on perception. The Semir Zeki had a lovely book, Art in the Brain. There are lots and lots of books like that. But, the books I read, there are some books I've read, neuroanatomy books and books filled with classical papers about neurophysiology and stuff. But they're not the ones I'm thinking of now. The ones I'm thinking of now are the ones that tell a great story.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate you sharing that. And how does art reconcile with Carl Friston's free energy principle?
Well, Carl, I know of him. He's a brilliant and very creative man. But let me quote from Google. I quote, "The Friston free energy principle is a theory proposing that all biological systems, including the brain, maintain their form and resist disorder by minimizing surprise," which is the difference between predictions of the world we experience. This minimization of free energy, a variational bound on surprise, occurs through Bayesian inference and the active adjustment of internal models to match sensory patterns, allowing systems to actively maintain their integrity within a changing environment. So I think that's a very intelligent, appealing statement, but there's no explicit mechanism that I know of in the brain or in art or any other model I know that minimizes surprise. Instead, a novel or surprising event, like every predictive disconfirmation in art, triggers hypothesis testing and memory search to discover a new category with which to effectively predict something novel in the world. So Carl's stuff doesn't work in a changing world. Mine does. That's huge. In order, disconfirmed expectation or surprise isn't minimized. Rather, it is used to drive hypothesis testing to discover and learn better recognition categories with which to represent and predict changes in the world. Also, likewise, Bayesian inference is usually defined in a stationary environment. That's whose conditional probabilities never change, and one that defines priors, how you start. And the Bayes rule is just two ways of writing the same statement about conditional probabilities. The probability of B given A times the probability of A equals the probability of A given B times the probability of B. That's a tautology. There's no scientific content. It's a mathematical definition. All the science comes from additional hypotheses that you add to Bayes. So look for the hidden hypotheses of anyone who uses Bayes. It's not in the Bayes rule. And so Bayesian inference is usually, as I say, defined in a stationary environment where you do it priors and stable conditional probabilities. In contrast, adaptive resonance theory thrives in a non-stationary or evolving environment one whose statistical rules may be continually changing. And so there are no priors, and there are no stable conditional probability. They don't exist in such a world. On the other hand, one of the things that art can do using what I call vigilance control, you might, for example, be doing medical database prediction, and there might be a series of diseases that cluster because they have similar symptoms. But then there might be an outlier, the first case of Ebola, say, or of COVID. And art can discover that without mushing it in with familiar diseases, using automatic vigilance control and what I call match tracking, which conjointly maximizes predictive generalization while minimizing predictive error. And in some cases, you've got to learn a concrete, narrow category. And in other cases, you learn a very general, vague category, like a concrete category. I now have a category of a frontal view of your face. That has high vigilance. But I also can recognize that people have faces, that they're general, not concrete.
And have you met Carl?
Oh, yes.
Many times. Yeah.
But I've lectured in Britain many times. And I've lectured all over the continent.
Mm-hmm.
And they kept inviting me back.
Yeah.
In fact, like in the Netherlands, in their big brain institute, and years ago, Speckreiser was director then. I'm blocking. I met some graduate students, and now they're the director. He's the director. So, and I met him when he was a graduate student. I was lecturing in their institute. And I saw him again when he was a director and I was lecturing in his institute. And he kindly sent two of his best postdocs to give me a good time around Amsterdam, which I very much had. I love Amsterdam. So, being this old has advantages, which is people you got to work like a dog. You got to be lucky. And you've got to learn how to think in real time, and you've got to know a lot. You've got to have good experimentation.
Yeah. Well, what are some of the current issues in the scientific enterprise, things like incentives and politics and other issues with the centralized scientific models and enterprise itself?
As we know, the federal government of the United States seems to be intent on destroying American science. It's a national tragedy. If only because science is one of the most profitable engines of the American economy. So funding of science in the past is one main reason why America has traditionally been a leader in all the technological progress that's been made. That's made our lives and the lives of millions of people around the world. It's one of the huge magnets that the gifted young people to our country, many of whom got advanced training here and then significant fraction stayed here and contributed greatly to our prosperity and our well-being. That's over. I don't know how long it'll take to recover. It might take a generation, but I couldn't predict the present and I cannot therefore. Let's just hope for the best.
Yeah. Awesome.
I would have given an answer a year ago.
No, I appreciate that answer. And is there any thoughts that keep you up at night most, things that you're always pondering more than others?
Well, I did just publish 2 articles in the last couple of years, and I'd like to read you their titles. And here I'll be getting into the learning. So in 2023, I wrote a paper, How Children Learn to Understand Language Meanings, a neural model of adult-child multimodal interactions in real time. And then this year, 2025, I was able to generalize, and this has the title, Neural Network Models of Autonomous Adaptive Intelligence and Artificial General Intelligence, how our brains learn large language models and their meanings. And I'd like to take the liberty of reading part of the abstract so you know what's involved and why it took me to the last few years to write about this topic, since I'd already been working for 66, 67 years to write about it. That's why I'm grateful to be alive, because a number of the things that I've done the last few years are, answering questions I've always wanted to know, but I wasn't ready to study. This article describes a biological neural network model that explains how humans learn to understand large language models and their meanings. This kind of learning typically occurs when a student learns from a teacher about events they experience together. So we're talking about real-time individual learning. Multiple types of self-organizing brain processes are involved, including content addressable memory, conscious visual perception, joint attention, object learning, categorization, and cognition, conscious recognition, cognitive working memory, cognitive planning, neural symbolic computing, emotion, cognitive emotional interactions and reinforcement learning, volition, and goal-oriented actions. And I had to work for decades to be able to understand those pieces. And then let me skip. These human capabilities are not found in AI models such as ChatGPT. Current model is called ChatSum. That's SOME. So it's sort of cute. ChatSum. Sum abbreviates self-organized meaning. And the article summarizes neural network highlights since the 50s and leading models, including adaptive resonance, deep learning, LLMs, and transformers. And so my article and work generally contrasts with the work of companies like OpenAI that have developed what they call large language models or LLMs. And they've continued a long AI tradition of dishonest marketing by claiming that LLMs like ChatGPT can lead to artificial general intelligence. I would claim in reality, ChatGPT can never in principle lead to autonomous adaptive intelligence or artificial general intelligence. And there's several reasons I can say it with conviction. First, ChatGPT builds on deep learning, which uses the backpropagation algorithm as its learning engine. As a result, as I showed in an oft-cited 1988 model, 88, 98, 208, 218, to almost 40 years ago, and they still didn't solve these problems. Deep learning is untrustworthy because its explanations are not explainable. You use it to make a prediction and it goes sour, and you ask the person who used deep learning, why did the prediction fail? They have to say, I don't know. It's also unreliable because it's slow learning which can take weeks or even months, even with large server farms, can unexpectedly experience catastrophic forgetting. An unpredictable part of the learned memory can just crash. Then you need to start training all over again from scratch. And they have to tell you how many times it had to be retrained. All we know is they use so much goddamn electricity that it's driving everyone else's electric bills up. So ChatGPT is misleadingly called a large language model, or LLM. There's no language there. There's no phonetics, there's no syntax, there's no semantics. It just promiscuously heaps together all the language fragments it can steal on the internet from the work of others. And then it uses a probabilistic output filter to guess the most likely reply to input queries out of this unstructured heap of stolen property. Literally doesn't know why it's for. And it could never or should never morally be used for any application that has life or death consequences, like financial or medical application. You might want to use it as an aid, just like Google or a medical database that you use in hospitals all the time. But you have to be very careful that you know enough to know that it's not lying to you. They love to say confabulate. All it means is it makes lots of mistakes. In contrast, my work does explain how humans learn large language meanings, as the titles of my two recent papers say. And I wish that Google Mind would put as many millions of dollars into developing Chatsum as it already has in the ChatGPT. You know, if they fully carry it out, would take quite a while and a lot of money. They'll make $1 trillion, but they got to be willing to do the investment. I'll be long dead. So.
Fascinating. Yeah. And how, over the years, how has your own perception of reality and your work been influenced by different technologies that emerged and AI?
Well, you know, at the risk of sounding full of myself, I think it's appropriate to say that my work with many colleagues has influenced technology and AI rather than the other way around. I've always looked to the data for inspiration, not to technology. And when I started and I introduced neural networks, I was explaining human verbal learning data. And of course, in the old days, AI wasn't neural networks. AI was symbolic AI, promulgated by people like Marvin Minsky. And do you know who Marvin was?
Yeah.
Well, Marvin and I were both professors in the MIT math department when he was promulgating symbolic AI, and I was developing neural networks at a ferocious rate. And Marvin couldn't stand that. And I think the reason is he always thought of himself as the smartest person around. And he started his career trying to introduce neural networks. And he failed. And he went to symbolic AI, so he could be useful. And then there's this young kid, scientist in his 20s, doing all this successful neural network work. I don't think he could stand it. But symbolic AI did hit a brick wall. It couldn't learn the way humans learned. It couldn't understand anything. And when it hit that brick wall, Marvin, just like a lot of other unscrupulous technologists, tried to expropriate other people's work without citation. So he wrote, what was it called? Uh, he wrote a popular book. I'm blocking on. Let me look it up. I'll Google it. Um, Society of Mind. And Marvin tried to sketch, aspects of mind in that book. Unfortunately, by that time, I and my colleagues had rigorously modeled and explained tons of data parametrically. His book was redundant. Uh, it didn't make a contribution.
Hmm.
I did live to um, have my comeuppance, as it were, because I became, a very well-known and respected scientist in the neural network and computational neuroscience, uh, the biologically inspired technology world. I founded um, uh, the International Neural Network Society, and I also put together with Gail Carpenter the first international. No, I did that with Bart Costco and Robert Heck Nielsen. Gail Carpenter and I worked together to try to make the first international conference on artificial neural networks in 1987. So I had a lot of influence on these annual neural network meetings. And I once suggested, I was general chairman of quite a few of them. I once suggested having Marvin give a keynote because I believe in, I'm a cup half full guy. I believe everyone should have a voice who someone thinks is worth hearing. I don't have to be the one. I was founding editor-chief of Neural Networks, the journal. Same thing there. We'll publish articles that are technically correct, even if I think it's derivative as hell, if there is an audience that thinks this will be helpful to them. Anyway, Marvin got up and he was so arrogant, he never prepared. But he started his lecture in a way that I really felt good. Before he spent the rest of his lecture telling jokes, he started by saying, I made one big mistake in my life. I underestimated Grossberg. And the whole audience roared with laughter because I ran that show. They all knew my work. And so Marvin eventually had to face the fact that if he had tried to grow into neural networks rather than shoot it down, he might have had a very different research trajectory.
Hmm.
The problem is it's not easy. And many people can make useful technical contributions and are hundreds, if not thousands, but it's much harder to create new concepts, new mechanisms, new models. A lot of work in all the sciences is mapping out the whole range of explanatory possibility that stabilizes science as a social phenomenon. And it's true in our science as well. There are very few people who create the foundations. It's true in physics. It's true in every field.
Mm-hmm.
And many gifted practitioners and technologists who can advance it, but maybe not make a seminal contribution. I don't say that as a criticism. I think that's how things work, and I think it's worked very well. And that's why we have such a flourishing society.
How has your work and research impacted how we look at disease and how we treat disease?
Which disease?
Anything like Alzheimer's, things like that, schizophrenia.
I remember I already commented about that briefly. because I mentioned in response to one of your questions that after explaining and simulating lots and lots of data about typical or normal behaviors, how the brain mechanisms lead to those behaviors. I noticed that particular imbalances in some of these processes led to syndromes or behavioral symptoms of specific mental disorders, including Alzheimer's, autism, and so on. And I also made the caveat, you recall that autism is a multi-genetic disease, and there are many parts of the brain that can be affected. And it turns out we had modeled all those parts of the brain. And for example, some autistic kids can't do spectral timing. They can't wait to get their reward. They can't time their impulsiveness to carry on a conversation. And you can trace that to breakdown in spectral timing, which we just discussed.
Yeah.
And the metabotropic glutamate receptor system plays a key role in adaptive timing in multiple species. It's been conserved through phylogeny. And if that goes, adaptive timing goes with it. And remember, it controls adaptive timing in basal ganglia too. And that regulates not only movement. We think of Parkinson's as being a movement disorder through a basal ganglia problem. It's also a cognitive disorder and an emotional disorder.
Mm.
And people didn't realize that at first. But advanced Parkinson's is a horrible, horrible disease. So, and in all of these things, the theory would develop in stages incrementally. You don't just suddenly see answers to profound questions. For example, in art, when you learn, there's an attentional system where you learn in the bottom-up filters, top-down expectations, pay attention and resonate to learn new categories and stuff. But when something unexpected occurs, it activates the orienting system, which deals with novelty and surprising events. And you might say, well, how novel or unexpected or mismatched does processing in the attentional system have to be to activate the orienting system, which is then going to drive reset and hypothesis testing to find and learn a better representation of the changing world. That's regulated by something called vigilance control that Gail Carpenter emphatically and I already showed how important it is in our 1987 Art 1 paper. Because if vigilance is high, then you have very sharp criterion for a category. So that would be like I'd learn a frontal view of your particular face. When vigilance is low, I can learn a general category. So how you regulate vigilance through time to try to get the most general categories that are predictive in a given environment is something we modeled. Anyway, it went through a series of developments, and one with my student Max Versace, we showed how it's regulated by the nucleus basalis of Minert, which responds to a mismatch in areas of the brain like the nonspecific thalamus to cause a burst of acetylcholine release throughout layer 5 of a lot of neocortex, which increases vigilance. And then experiments Max and I saw explained a lot of data with our paper, and then there were papers later which supported the prediction. So you don't wake up in the morning and say, I'm suddenly interested in the nucleus basalis of Meinhardt and in cholinergic metabolism. You don't. But after having done it, you notice that if both tonic vigilance and phasic vigilance via nucleus basalis collapse, you become basically catatonic. You can behave like an advanced Alzheimer's person who does have major problems with cholinergic metabolism. Is that the end of the story? No. Does it create an interesting link for further study? I think so.
Yeah.
So it's that sort of thing. Did I ever dream I'd say this sentence at some point in my life? No way.
Right.
But that's what's wonderful about it. That's why I think I'm still creative, because my life is still filled with unexpected events, which are well known to be one of the ways to help people with dementia. Enliven their lives with unexpected emotional things, like music and dancing.
What are your thoughts on the current psychedelic research? There seems to be so much when it comes to neuroscience studying psychedelics.
Now, you have to tell me more about it. I haven't thought about psychedelics
Okay.
since Harvard days with, Timothy Leary and
Yeah.
those guys.
And what did you, I mean, we'll go back to that because that's where it really kicked off in the institutions with those guys, but now it's become a renaissance.
That, you know, a number of top uh, Harvard young scientists and mathematicians uh, went on a trip with Timothy Leary. They weren't creative for at least a year after that. Just blew their minds, literally.
Mm-hmm.
Be careful. Yin yang balance, respect it. Balance, respect it. Don't school. There are arousal levels. You want to be in the golden mean.
Yeah.
If you can, to be centered, the notion of being centered, like in meditation.
Yep.
There's wisdom in these things. Don't screw it up.
Yeah. So that's your view, is to stay away from it. There is a lot of current research on the benefits from using them for PTSD and for different issues, and even for Alzheimer's.
Well, part of the problem with PTSD is that, you can get locked into a bottom-up, top-down resonance, the traumatic experience that sort of burns your adaptive weights in so fiercely that it competitively inhibits everything else. You can't get out of it. That's what the trauma included, that there are physical things and biochemical things, but one part of it, I believe, is that you get locked into repeating over and over and over the horrible traumatic event. You wake up with these horrible nightmares of things that happened when you were a young man in World War II or Korea or wherever, Vietnam. So the psychedelic, I think, can break through. And I haven't studied the underlying science behind how it may break through, but you can sort of see how it can open up cognitive, emotional pathways, for example, that'll try to competitively inhibit the one that's driving you nuts.
Yeah.
It's all about competition in the affective regions of the brain, like amygdala, hypothalamus, and in the perceptual cognitive regions. And if you can get through, that's what a lot of therapy is trying to do, help you to, like behavior therapy, trying to help you to substitute positive and positively rewarding behaviors and environments to competitively inhibit the bad stuff. And that's one reason why it's very useful to get out of the triggering environment. But when the triggering environment is locked into your memories, you need something more powerful, something that can pharmacologically break through. And I think the psychedelics are probably doing, but I haven't studied it, so I'm speculating.
Fair enough. I always ask everybody, if you were going to die today, if this was the last thing you could say to the world, is there anything you'd like to share?
I feel very lucky. I mean, I've had wonderful colleagues, wonderful students. I've had multiple ecstatic experiences of discovery. I'm married to the love of my life for over 50 years. We have a wonderful daughter and 2 wonderful grandchildren who live nearby. What could be luckier than that? My father died of Hodgkin's lymphoma when I was 1 and he was 28. Today, Hodgkin's lymphoma is almost entirely curable. But from my very early years, I was aware of mortality. Death was part of my experience. And so from a very early age, I felt we're here for a very short time. And I wanted to find a way to touch God. Of course, this is a pantheistic Einsteinian kind of God. And see some of the beauty of the world while I still have a chance. And I would do it ferociously because it could end at any moment. And having grown up in New York, where what is reality at that time in New York? Buildings, pets like dogs and cats, and people. Of those choices, people interested me the most because I needed to understand, what is the human condition? I mean, I can go into, I had experiences when I was a baby, and I write about that in my new book. But I needed to understand the human condition while we're here. And I've gone about it with passion and even ferocity. But I studied Eastern philosophy as a sophomore in college. Have you ever studied Buddhism?
Yeah,
So you might know a lot more than I do. I haven't studied it since. There's Hinayana Buddhism where you try to get to nirvana yourself. But I'm a Mahayana Buddhist, where you try to bring as many other people as you can to nirvana. And that's what I've done through my work and my teaching and my friends and colleagues. I'm a very shy Mahayana Buddhist, but you'd never guess it because I've worked very hard to overcome it. But that's what I try to do. But, if you leave me to myself, that's okay, because my mind is filled with stuff. I'm always thinking about something I really, really want to know. I just think it's such a gift to be alive and to have consciousness. I really, really want to know more. And I have a new project. I won't tell you what it is. I don't know if I'll be able to understand it. And so I never like to say I'm working on this because sometimes it takes me 10 or 20 years to break through. I have to sort of sit with it and and I don't have 10 or 20 years. But if I do make some progress and I have a little advance warning before I kick off, I'll try to make my partial results available if someone else wants to carry it. But I've already made so much stuff available. You know, go to my webpage, sites, sites.bu.edu/Steve G, STEVEG. Sites, w.edu Steve G. It has interviews, it has videos of keynote lectures, and it has around 570 archival articles about every aspect of how our brains make our minds. So I've left that behind, that's all. And I have a deal, we'll see how long it lasts, that the university will preserve my webpage for the foreseeable future.
Beautiful.
Resource. And you know, then I have, you know, some of these popular little articles like Recurrent Neural Nets. It's been downloaded over 200,000 times. So some of them have an impact. And, you know, I'm not what you call popular because I'm not an easy lay, you know. This is hard to understand. And even if I'm self-contained and non-technical, some of the things that are going on are subtle. You can't get away from emergent properties. You can't get away from resonance. I know once I was reading one of my own papers, and I was really tired, and I hadn't read it for a while. I don't usually read my own stuff. But I saw it lying there. I said, oh, I wonder if I still like it. I couldn't understand the goddamn thing because I couldn't picture it. You need intuition and pictorial ability and so on and so forth. I'm sympathetic that I'm not an easy lay and that there are much more popular scientists, but I don't think anyone has given as broad and deep an understanding of issues related to mind and brain as I have. There were wonderful specialists, but I'm called the Newton and Einstein of the mind for a reason. And I'm not embarrassed to say it. At my age, you've left embarrassment long ago.
That's beautiful. No, I appreciate your time today, and I'm really looking forward to reading your new book that you're going to write about your creative process.
No, it's in press. It'll be published in December or January.
Awesome.
Time. I already corrected the proofs.
Excellent.
So that's coming out. And, you know, my magnum opus came out just as COVID hit. Lucky me. No conferences, if book stands, no bookstores, no marketing. So it sold okay, but I was hoping 10 times as many people would have bought it. So if you like it, promote it, please.
Absolutely.
It's alive today as it was then. My discoveries age well.
Beautiful. I really do appreciate your time today. We went over 2 hours here, so I do appreciate it very much. It was an honor.
Thank you for listening to the episode. Be sure to subscribe to the show on Spotify, YouTube, and iTunes, and rate the show. I hope you enjoyed the episode.
What we call reality is in fact nothing more than a culturally sanctioned and linguistically reinforced hallucination.